हेलो फ्रेंड्स, वेलकम बैक टू माय चैनल। फ्रेंड्स, हमने नायग्रा फोर्ट तो देख लिए। अभी हम लोग जा रहे हैं म्यूजियम। जो म्यूजियम में पहले जो 300 इयर्स की जो सामान वगैरह है, फोटो भी है थोड़ा सा, और यहाँ के हिस्ट्री सब लिखा हुआ। तो आपको थोड़ा थोड़ा क्लिप्स दिखा रही हूँ फ्रेंड्स। और यहाँ का हिस्ट्री के बारे में छोटा सा एक मूवी है, जो आप जरूर देखना फ्रेंड्स।
For over a century and a half, through eras of war and peace, four nations, a continent. You are about to experience one of North America's most unique historic sites.
In the case of Fort Niagara, the very ground is hallowed. You're standing on the soil where it happened.
In this rare collection of original military architecture is the oldest building on the Great Lakes.
It's real. This isn't a movie. It's not a made-up facade. This is real history, and you get to come in contact with all of these great events. That's a very, very rare opportunity to have.
The French were the first Europeans to explore the water route that led from the Atlantic Ocean into the heart of North America.
In the 17th century, before there were artificial means of transportation, even roads, and barely trails, the easiest way to get around was by the water. And so if you controlled an important point on a water route, you could, in effect, control this whole water highway.
The most vital point on this waterway was the Niagara Portage, a trail that bypassed the Great Falls. It was here that the French built a series of outposts. Their attempts to control this lucrative trade route would set them into conflict with an old rival, England. For either empire to succeed, they needed the friendship of America's great power, the Iroquois Confederacy. In the early 1720s, the French asked local Iroquois for permission to build a new outpost on the Niagara River.
The house must not have the appearance of a fort, so that no offense will be given to the Iroquois, who have been unwilling to allow any there, but it will answer the purposes of a fort just as well. Gouverneur Vaudreuil, 1725.
In 1727, French builders completed a so-called House of Peace, today known as the French Castle. While it looked like a house, it had all the elements of a fort. Inside was room for some 40 soldiers. On the third floor, overhanging dormers allowed defenders to fire down on attackers. Walls of thick stone could withstand anything short of artillery.
When they are finished, of course, they have staged an incredible coup on the British, and the British are howling in protest that they have established this very formidable little house here at a very critical juncture in the transportation and supply routes.
In time, tensions between the empires would erupt into all-out war, and the House of Peace would be at the center of an epic battle. The Great War for Empire, also known as the French and Indian War, began in the wilds of the New World and spread like wildfire throughout the colonies.
This is going to be the last and the greatest of the colonial wars, and will really determine the fate of North American history much more than anything that comes after it.
In the spring of 1759, 3,000 British soldiers and their Iroquois allies moved to attack Fort Niagara. Arriving on July 6th, they are humbled by what they see. Under the command of Pierre Pouchot, the French have made extensive improvements to the fort. A ring of ditches and earthen walls protect the fort from cannon fire and attacking infantry. A large powder magazine with walls 4 feet thick shelters their ammunition.
And the battle that takes place here in July 1759 is going to take place right out of a European siege manual.
The British begin their slow, methodical attack on Fort Niagara.
This was done by digging a trench, by literally digging their way toward the fort. And they would dig in a zigzag fashion so that cannon fire from the fort couldn't go straight down their trench. You didn't want to point your trench right at the fort. That was turn it into a death trap.
The British idea is going to be to get your cannons closer and closer to the walls of the fort so that you can do more and more damage.
For 2 weeks, the 600-man French garrison held out while the British moved their cannons toward the fort. By July 23rd, the British have closed to within 100 yards, yet the French receive news that a relief force is on the way. 1 mile to the south, some 500 British and irregulars wait for over 1,000 French soldiers. They waited until the French were within about 30 yards, 90 feet. They literally obliterated the head of the French column. British soldiers began to rapidly fire round after round as quickly as they could fire. Within 30 minutes, the French attack collapses. Pouchot decides to give up the fort and ask the British for terms of surrender.
The entire length of the Fort Niagara siege covered about 19 days. That's a very respectable length of time for a fort like Niagara to hold out against a besieging army. In fact, it's one of the longer sieges in the history of North America.
The British capture of Niagara severs the French lifeline to the west. 1759 became a year of victories for the British, and the Union Jack would fly over Fort Niagara for the next 4 decades. British occupation would transform the fort. For the rest of the 18th century, British forces centered at Niagara controlled access to the Great Lakes. With forts running from Nova Scotia to northern Michigan, they exerted their dominance over the region. But in the aftermath of a native rebellion in the 1760s, the British are forced to reevaluate the fort's defenses. Built in 2 corners of the fort were 2 stone towers called redoubts. These small, 3-story buildings were forts within a fort. Inside was a guard room for 25 men, and on the roof was a cannon battery.
One of the British officers involved in the construction of these buildings said that no force of Native Americans would ever pass between the fire of these 2 buildings in an attempt to attack Fort Niagara.
But in the spring of 1775, a new rebellion was brewing as colonists on the eastern seaboard challenged British rule. During the 8-year war for American independence, Fort Niagara became a sanctuary for those who opposed the revolution.
During the Revolutionary period, you see a lot of these loyalists fleeing to Fort Niagara for British protection. Many of these individuals are formed into military units of sorts, irregular military units to be short, but very, very effective ones.
Beginning in 1778, these loyalists and their native allies raided American settlements.
During the American Revolution, the Iroquois were very successful sending small groups into agriculturally productive areas. And New York was the breadbasket, really, of the colonies. And the Indians had a big impact on shutting down farming.
In 1779, Continental forces retaliated against the raiders by marching into Iroquois territory.
The Continental Force cut a swath through this area, destroying houses, destroying food supplies, doing everything that was possible to drive the Iroquois out of the war.
From a military perspective, the raid is not terribly successful. It certainly does not put the Iroquois out of the war, although it does create a period of very bitter hardship for both the Iroquois and their British allies.
During the long, cold winter of 1780, hundreds of Iroquois who took refuge at Fort Niagara starved to death. Though the American revolutionaries won the war, they were in no position to force the British off the Great Lakes. It took 11 years to resolve land claims and treaty disputes before Fort Niagara was finally handed over to the Americans. To maintain a presence in the area, in 1796 the British built a new outpost, Fort George, just 3/4 of a mile away across the new border in Canada.
Fort Niagara was never designed to be a border fortification. Its defenses, first of all, are facing the wrong direction.
In addition, Fort George's cannon batteries stood 9 feet higher.
In the age of muzzle-loading artillery, a height advantage like that was fairly important, and so the British, in many ways, had a better position in Fort George.
In June of 1812, the U.S. Congress, angered over violations of national sovereignty, declared war on Britain. And in October, Fort Niagara's batteries opened fire on Fort George. The British returned fire. Height advantage pulverized Fort Niagara. The costly lesson forced the Americans to make changes.
They do a number of things, not the least of which is to remove the roof from the stone house, the French castle, and turn the top floor into an elevated gun deck.
This alteration gave the Americans the height advantage. In May of 1813, the combined cannons of Fort Niagara and American warships all but destroyed Fort George.
While the campaign of 1813 starts out very optimistically for the American Army with the capture of Fort George, things tend to turn sour after that.
By the end of the year, Fort George was left in the hands of restless militiamen, eager to return home.
The Americans decided to abandon the Canadian side, retreat back to the eastern shore, and in doing so burned not only the remnants of Fort George, but the entire town of Newark.
The action had dire consequences for Fort Niagara as the British took revenge. On December 18th, 562 British soldiers launched a daring nighttime assault.
It should be impressed upon the mind of every man that the bayonet is the weapon on which the success of the attack must depend. Lieutenant General Gordon Drummond.
The British surprised the American sentries and forced their way inside. Most of the American garrison was asleep. Small groups of defenders put up stiff resistance. But in less than 30 minutes, it was all over. 340 American soldiers became prisoners of war, and 65 lay dead.
The British had achieved a major military victory. They captured a trove of equipment, and they took the flag as a trophy of war.
On the morning of December 19, 1813, the Union Jack was flying at Fort Niagara once again. The Treaty of Ghent ends the War of 1812. Fort Niagara is returned to the Americans. The fort has seen its last shots fired in anger. In the 1820s, with the opening of the Erie and Welland canals and their passage around the falls, Fort Niagara loses its strategic importance. Minor border crises spurred further changes to the fort, but these improvements soon became obsolete.
Following the Civil War, you get a real change in focus of the garrisons here. No longer is the walled fortification going to be an effective deterrent to modern artillery that can tear masonry fortifications apart. And so what you get instead is more of an emphasis on training. Fort Niagara reinvents itself.
Outside the fort's walls, American troops trained for remote wars in Cuba, the Philippines, and Europe. But after World War I, the old fort was abandoned, and nearly 3 centuries of history was in danger of disappearing.
There were serious problems. The French castle was starting to collapse. There was always the relentless pounding of Lake Ontario against the point and the seawall that protected the fort.
Beginning in the mid-1920s, a number of people started to take a very keen interest in seeing that these buildings don't disappear.
Today, on behalf of New York State, the Old Fort Niagara Association manages the site. Your dollars support this not-for-profit group and its mission to preserve this unique historic place. It began as a frontier outpost almost 3 centuries ago. It became a fortress of 3 empires.
It was the center of a struggle for a continent for many, many years. There are others that were equal linchpins, but Niagara, I think, is chief amongst them.
On this hallowed battlefield is the history of North America.
And you walk across the parade ground of Fort Niagara, and you know that on the night of December 19th, 1813, there were soldiers running across there with bayonets being fired on, firing at people, dying. Cannonballs flew over the walls in 1759, and you're in a place where real things happen, and I think that provides real connection